At around 10:15 p.m. on the 9th of June 1979, a fire broke out on the ghost train at Luna Park in Sydney, Australia. The fire would ultimately claim 7 lives, wiping out almost an entire family in the process. It was a devastating blaze, the true cause of which remains, to this day, unknown. The ride itself was fairly old at the time of the disaster. It started life in 1931 as a dark ride at Luna Park Glenelg. At the time, rides of this type were known as pretzel rides, so called because the track twisted and turned extremely tightly within the confines of the ride building. It wasn't until 1937 that the attraction was given a ghostly makeover and reopened as the Ghost Ride. Metal cars seated 2 riders each and, after being pushed from the station by a ride attendant, followed the preset track through a series of darkened rooms filled with spooky animatronics, creepy music, and special effects. While the interior of the ride had been rethemed and revised constantly over the years, the track layout had remained unchanged since 1936. The ride was still as twisting, turning, and confusing as it had been back when it was a pretzel dark ride. Unfortunately, the fire suppression systems which had been retrofitted into the ancient ride were also somewhat out of date and dismally insufficient to smother the blaze that began on that fateful evening in 1979. There were approximately 35 people on board when the fire began. The first indication staff had that something was amiss was when smoke began pouring from the entrance and exit tunnels of the ride. Rather than stop the ride and try to evacuate guests through the complicated and confusing interior corridors, they left it running, and instead focused their energies on getting guests out of their cars and away from the ride as soon as they emerged from the tunnel. The fire service attended, but by the time they arrived, the fire had already taken hold. Their efforts to extinguish it were further hampered by low water pressure within the park, leading them to eventually draw water from the harbour to fight the flames. Within an hour, the entire ride building was consumed, collapsing into a pile of twisted wreckage. It was thought initially that all riders had been evacuated safely, but at around 11:30 p.m, 7 bodies were discovered. They were so badly burned that investigators at first assumed them to be animatronics from the ride's theming. The bodies included those of a father and his 2 children. John Godson had been visiting Luna Park with his wife and kids. The ghost train was their final ride of the day, and one that his wife declined to join them on. Instead of riding the ghost train, she went to get an ice cream, and agreed to meet them at the exit of the ride. This decision might very well have saved her life, but left her as the only surviving member of her family. The other victims were 4 schoolchildren from nearby Waverley Boys College: Jonathan Billings, Richard Carroll, Michael Johnson, and Seamus Rahilly, all just 12 or 13 years old at the time. It is speculated that, when the fire broke out, the 7 victims left their cars and attempted to escape the building on foot. In the dark, confined, smoke-filled passageways of the ghost train, they lost their way and succumbed to the smoke. Although we cannot be certain, there is a chance that had they remained within their cars, they may have survived the blaze. The cause of the fire itself was never established, although in later years, Abe Saffron, a notorious member of the Sydney underworld, was linked to the fire. His niece told authorities that he had started the fire as part of a plot to take control of Luna Park's lease, although he had never intended for anyone to die. Abe Saffron, of course, denied all involvement, and nothing was ever proven. The victims of the fire are now memorialised by a small plaque on the external wall of the Big Top Arena, which stands on the one-time site of the ghost train. Luna Park continues to operate as ever it did, visited by millions each year.